Bienvenidos a todos, mi nombre es María Martí, soy presidente del Ayn Rand Center Latinoamérica y muy contenta de estar aquí presente para este nuevo webinario que presenta el centro. El próximo, todos los seminarios que nosotros hacemos son los martes a las 6 de la tarde, son webinarios en realidad, perdón, los martes a las 6 de la tarde de Argentina. No tenemos todavía programado el del martes que viene, pero próximamente se los vamos a adelantar por nuestras redes sociales como para que puedan inscribirse. Todos son transmitidos también por Facebook Live y próximamente después los vamos a subir a nuestros canales de YouTube. Para conocer un poquito nuestra audiencia, queremos pedirles por favor que también nos acompañen siguiéndonos en nuestro website, el aynrandlatam.org, donde hay valioso contenido sobre, digamos, traducciones de contenido de Ayn Rand, videos y de diferentes intelectuales objetivistas. También les pedimos que se suscriban a nuestro newsletter mensual, en donde justamente les llevamos las novedades de todas las actividades que llevamos a cabo. En las redes sociales estamos en el Ayn Rand Center Latinoamérica, que es nuestra fanpage, y también tenemos un grupo de discusión y de debate llamado Ayn Rand Latinoamérica. Se pueden sumar a él cuando quieran, y también seguirnos en Instagram y en Twitter, estamos allí como Ayn Rand Latam. Lo que queremos pedirles ahora es para conocer un poquito cuál es la situación de nuestra audiencia respecto a las ideas de Ayn Rand. Les vamos a proponer aquí unas preguntas para conocer su familiaridad, desde muy poca, así que casi no han escuchado de Ayn Rand, hasta sí, que están muy familiarizados con sus ideas. Les vamos a dar 10 segundos, por favor, para completar esta encuesta. Seguimos entonces. Exxon, si me puedes cambiar la diapositiva, gracias. Bueno, nos preguntan es por dónde empezar con las ideas del objetivismo, cómo conocer más. Siempre la recomendación es vayan directamente a las fuentes, lean más Ayn Rand, que tiene una bibliografía increíble de libros no ficción, pueden elegir a gusto. Si les gustan más las historias y las novelas, en Los que vivimos, El manantial, Anthem, Himno y La rebelión de Atlas, que es su obra maestra. Y de no ficción tienen muchísima cantidad de libros también. Recomiendo particularmente para aquellos que se inician Filosofía, quien la necesita, La virtud del egoísmo y Capitalismo, el ideal desconocido. En el día de hoy tenemos un tema delicado y muy especial, que es justamente el tema de aborto y derechos individuales. Bueno, aquí, perdón, sí. Aborto y derechos individuales. Vamos a tener una sesión un poco diferente a las que fueron las anteriores. El objetivo es, Ben Bayer, que próximamente lo voy a introducir, lo voy a presentar, va a hacer una presentación sobre el tema justamente de los derechos individuales en relación al aborto durante unos 40 minutos. Luego va a tener una conversación con Gloria Álvarez durante unos 20-25 minutos y después hasta las 7:30 de la tarde, hora argentina, también vamos a responder las preguntas que vayan mandando el público. Pueden mandar sus preguntas acá, la gente que está en Zoom, en el Q&A, y los demás pueden también postear sus preguntas en cualquiera de las redes sociales que estamos en este momento. Ayn Rand Center Latinoamérica, la fanpage, en Ayn Rand Institute Global, también en Facebook, y en el YouTube y Facebook de Gloria Álvarez. So now I'm going to switch a little bit to English. The name of the webinar today is Abortion and Individual Rights, and our lecturer is Ben Bayer. Ben Bayer is, give me one sec, because here's in Spanish, but I'm going to say it in English for our English-speaking audience. Ben Bayer is instructor and fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. He teaches in the Objectivist Academic Center, lectures, and gives interviews for ARI. He also writes and edits for ARI's online publication, New Idea. Dr. Bayer holds a PhD in philosophy, and his writing focuses primarily on the application of philosophy to contemporary cultural and political controversies. Dr. Bayer has more than a decade of experience in teaching a wide range of philosophy courses at colleges and universities across the United States. And Gloria Álvarez, who's going to interview and have a conversation with Ben, is a Guatemaltecan, I don't know how to say, political scientist and international affairs bachelor's in art, especially focused in international development and economics from UFM, Universidad Francisco Marroquín. She has positioned herself as a reference of libertarianism in the Americas and Europe, giving more than 2,000 conferences and through radio, TV, and social media. She has published 3 books. She launched her presidential campaign for Guatemala in 2019, and currently she's a second-year student of the OSC. So Ben is your professor, Gloria. So welcome, both of you. Thank you very much for being here. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, Maria.
And we all know that it's a delicate topic, but I think it's very important to focus on this topic from the point of view of individual rights. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you
very much, to be
Maria.
here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
No, it's always a pleasure. So we will. The audience is all yours, Ben. So you can start with your presentation, and after when you finish, just Gloria will join you for this conversation.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
All right. So the title that I gave to the presentation today is Abortion and Individual Rights, but I'm actually going to say more about individual rights than I do about abortion, and I'm going to start by talking about that. That's for 2 reasons. One is because I think there's actually a lot that we can learn about individual rights, especially about Ayn Rand's view of individual rights, by looking at it through the lens of the abortion controversy. And I actually think we can't possibly resolve this controversy. There's no hope of resolving it. We don't have a clear understanding of the concept of individual rights to begin with. So I'll also start by observing that if you look at the way the controversy actually plays out, abortion is one of the last big cultural political controversies in the West that is still argued about in terms of rights. The woman is said to have a right to choose, so you get slogans like her body, her choice. The fetus is said to have a right to life. This whole debate is definitely in terms of rights. It's sometimes portrayed as a conflict between 2 rights: the woman's right to choose versus the right of the fetus. And so one thing that we should be thinking about as we go through this today is whether it even makes sense to say that rights can come into conflict. The usual way of thinking about this is that they do, and then the way that you resolve the abortion controversy is to say, well, one right somehow outweighs the other. And there's even a number of U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have basically been made on that kind of basis. But another possibility is that it's not a conflict of rights at all. It's that one of these 2 sides is simply wrong to think that there is a right of the kind that they are speaking up on behalf of. And I'm going to begin today by clarifying the idea of individual rights, especially as informed by the perspective of Ayn Rand's view of individual rights. And I think that's going to have some direct and immediate implications for how we end up, which of those 2 ways we end up settling this controversy. Okay, so let's start with the really big, fundamental, most important question. What are rights? What are individual rights? Why are they important? Why do we actually even need them? At one point in the 1970s, Ayn Rand herself said the following. She said, "The concept of individual rights is so prodigious a feat of political thinking that few men grasp it fully. But this is the concept to which we owe our lives, the concept which made it possible for us to bring into reality everything of value that any of us did or will ever achieve or experience." Now, I happen to think that Ayn Rand was one of history's greatest defenders, champions of individual rights as a moral concept. Of course, it's on this basis that, among other things, she was a champion of laissez-faire capitalism and an opponent of all forms of collectivism. She was a champion of capitalism, opponent of collectivism on the grounds of individual rights, which she took as moral grounds for supporting capitalism, opposing collectivism. So when someone for whom the concept of individual rights is so central in her thinking about these really grand-scale political topics, says that most people don't even understand this concept, it's a good idea to listen to what she has to say and to try to understand her view of that concept. And that's what I want to do today. The concept of individual rights, to speak very generally, it's definitely a kind of concept that serves to circumscribe, morally speaking, a political system. It gives guidance for what governments shouldn't do and what they should do. But it has as its root a more general view of human morality and of human nature. And so what I want to do next is to start to make a list of a small number of really basic facts about human nature that relate to this moral perspective, that then go to form the basis for what Ayn Rand thinks is the basis for the concept of individual rights. And the first place to start with this is to note that distinctively human concept. They apply distinctively and uniquely to human beings. She knows of no other beings, including not even animals, who she thinks have individual rights. That doesn't mean there's no moral guidance with regard to them, but only human beings have rights. And that's because there's something distinctive, she thinks, about the human way of living that gives rise to the need for rights. So we don't live like plants or like animals. We don't just gather or consume resources from the environment that are already out there. She thinks human beings survive in a distinctive way. We have to rearrange the environment and create the resources to suit our purposes. And one way of putting this point is that, according to Rand at least, what's distinctively human about our way of living is that we require thought and production in order to live. We have to discover the laws of nature, the principles of cause and effect with our own minds, to build everything from the most basic tools to whole new forms of industry and technology in order to solve the problem of survival. That's how we rearrange the environment and create resources for our purposes. So let's make that the first point on the list of facts about us for why we need individual rights. First fact, there's a very distinctive human form of living. Human life requires thought and production. And one thing that I would add to this, this is not simply a point about how we are distinctive with regard to the whole living kingdom. There's also something very distinctive about us in relation to one noteworthy class of animals. So we are not at all like ants or bees or any other creatures that live in hives or swarms or schools, like schools of fish. One of the things that's distinctive about human beings is in using our mind to discover those cause and effect principles, those laws of nature in order to survive, it's something that we have to do on our own, of our own free will. We don't function like cells in some bigger organism. We are individuals, not only insofar as we are physically separate from other human beings, but because we have free will, we can choose our own ends, we can devise our own means to obtain those ends, and so we're individuals on two different levels, on the level of just physical separation and on the level of choosing our own paths in life. So far are we from other creatures that we do not exist like cells in some larger organism. And this is the fundamental reason why Ayn Rand was an individualist. And that's going to have a lot to do with her view of individual rights. And now, if it's true that we live through this means of rational thought and production, it's important to understand, well, for one thing, that's a choice too. We don't have to make that choice. And there are things that can get in the way of our making that choice. If you had to think about what's the opposite choice you could make, or the thing that could oppose your choice to engage in thinking and production, well, what's the opposite of reason and persuasion? It's the use of physical force. So as opposed to discovering and creating something for yourself, somebody who decides to use force will try to take it from somebody else, will threaten them with some form of destruction. And when you use force in this way, when you choose to use force in this way, it's interesting because, first of all, you're treating other people as though they were animals, as though they can be herded and corralled and whipped and expropriated from, as though they were farm animals. But you're also acting like an animal yourself, insofar as you're not engaging in any first-handed creative production. Instead, you're just taking resources that are already out there. So for all of those reasons, the second big important fact we need to put on our list that's related to why we need individual rights is because that choice to use force, when certain people make that choice, it interferes with that distinctive form of life, with that distinctive human form of life that involves rationality and production. It interferes with our thinking. If some thug decides to destroy, let's say, an inventor's invention, the inventor then can't make use of the products of his mind. He can't use them to live. He can't profit by selling them. He can't make long-term plans to build using his profits or his creation. Other people can't benefit from such trades, etc. So let's also add that to the list of important facts that form the basis for why we need individual rights. The second fact is force interferes with human thought, with that distinctive human form of living that I mentioned in the first point. And therefore, it interferes with human life itself. Here again, I'm going to make a contrast. I mentioned previously human beings are distinctive, especially in contrast to, let's say, ants and bees and hive creatures who operate much more like they're cells in an organism than like individuals. If it were true that we were cells in an organism, if we were just part of a collective, it would be a lot harder to understand what was wrong with force, what would be wrong with living by force. It is, after all, the way the rest of the animal kingdom lives. If you don't have a mind of your own, if you're just a cell in a large organism, then you automatically act to serve your function. You don't have a choice about it. And if, for whatever accidental reason, you should happen to malfunction, then you're manipulated by the larger organism, or you're even expelled. So it's not obvious why force would be wrong. There wouldn't even be a right or wrong about it. It's just what automatically happens for creatures that don't live by rationality. So again, the fact that we are individuals, where what individuates us is not just physical separation, but our faculty of choice, plays an important part in understanding why force is wrong, and that's also going to inform our understanding of individual rights. Now, all of this said, even though it's true that there are these dangers that we face from other people when we live near them, they can use force against us. Even still, there are great benefits to be had by living in society. If there are other rational people who are creating and producing and trading with us. But of course, these benefits are only available if we're free from other people's interference, other people's force to begin with. And so that's a problem that needs a solution. Historically, governments have been, for the most part, in the vast sweep of history, run basically by gangs who were no different than roving criminals in their intent to plunder and pillage, and so were simply concentrated organizations for using force in a systematic way, which had devastating consequences on people's lives. But governments are run by people, just like anything else. people have free will, they can make choices, and it's possible to have a government that is ruled not by the whims of men, but by rule of law, which is subject to the consent of the governed. And if that's the case, then it is possible, at least, for government to become an agency that uses force, but only in opposition to other force, only in opposition to the initiation of force. Of course, to do this, it needs to have some understanding of what it's doing. It needs to be able to create certain kinds of rules and boundaries that enable us all to live together peacefully without force. Government run this way enables human coexistence. It enables that distinctive human form of life by extracting force from social relations. So I'll add that as the last big fact that informs our understanding of individual rights. Now, of course, the question is, how exactly is government going to go about doing this? What kinds of rules and boundaries is it going to set up in order to make space for people to live truly human lives? And that is the guidance that it needs, that the concept of individual rights is there to give. I like to think of rights as defining spheres of freedom in a social context. What they really are is they're kinds of boundaries around our lives. And if the boundaries are drawn carefully enough, they prevent people from coming into conflict in the first place. Or when these conflicts do happen, they provide the means of resolving these conflicts because there's a prior notion of who has come into conflict with whom. Here's the way that Ayn Rand summarized her view of rights. She said, "A right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. There's only one fundamental right. All the others are its consequences or corollaries." And notice what she says is the one fundamental right. A man's right to his own life. Interesting. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. What is this life that we have the right to? The right to life means the right to engage in self-sustaining and self-generated action, which means the freedom to take all the actions required by the nature of a rational being for the support, the furtherance, the fulfillment, and the enjoyment of his own life. Now, let me just highlight a couple of aspects of this statement that I think are especially relevant to the abortion controversy that we're about to start to discuss. One of these is that, in her view, a right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning freedom in a social context. Social existence, the kind of social existence she's talking about here, is the kind where it's possible for beings to come into conflict with each other, but where that's not necessary, where they can avoid these conflicts if they're given a kind of protective sphere of freedom. So that's one thing important to keep in mind. I will come back to that. Other thing I'll mention about this is that she has a very distinctive idea of what the right to life means. She says the right to life means the freedom to take all the actions, and she gives a number of them, but ending with all the actions needed for the enjoyment of one's own life. So for her, the right to life is not simply the right not to be killed. It is that in part, but it's much more than that. And that's because she has, as I started the conversation explaining, a very distinctive idea of what human life is. Human life is not simply a heartbeat. It is not simply a pulse. It is not even simply the presence of brainwaves. It is this whole process, this active process of using your mind to discover things about the world, to create values, and in a society that means create and trade with others. That's going to also be important for understanding her view of what the right to life means and what it doesn't. But let's now take this understanding of rights and apply it to a case study, and to the kind of case study that I think Ayn Rand is the most famous for having made. Let's talk about how all of this relates, for instance, to her defense of laissez-faire capitalism, or of liberalism, as I think you would say in Latin America. Let's give a simple example. A woman decides to start a business. Let's say it's a store selling labor-saving devices, just to pick an example. Now, this is an activity that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of long-range planning, a lot of hard work, and it's thinking and work that she's only willing to do because she's motivated by profits. She's not some worker drone whose job is just to repeat some pre-programmed function. She has to make choices as an autonomous individual. That means this is an exemplary case of living a distinctively human life. Through thought and production, she creates a product that she puts on a market, which then everybody wins from when the trade happens. This enables everybody, including especially herself, to do even more of the same. More thinking, more production. It's a kind of virtuous circle. So what does it look like when government engages in the proper protection of her rights? A proper government concerned with the protection of individual rights, in Ayn Rand's view, would do things like, for instance, protect her right to the pursuit of happiness, to make as much profit as she can possibly make through her own honest business dealings. It would protect her right to property, which would mean she gets to own the shop, she gets to purchase the necessary supplies and commodities, she gets to be free from things like arbitrary regulations and taxation, she gets to be free to dispose of her property as she sees fit, so she can use her profits to buy anything she wants or to give away whatever she has. And she has the right to liberty, so she has the right to advertise her products, communicate with other people about her business dealings. She can hire whomever she likes from whichever country, as long as they're not threatening anyone else. So that's what it looks like for government to protect her rights. That's what it looks like for the capitalist system to be truly laissez-faire. Government takes its hands off and protects all rights, including property rights. But let's take one step back from that to just observe that that whole complex of rights is what Ayn Rand means by the right to life. Because again, for her, life for human beings is a distinctive thing. It's a life of thinking and production. And so the right to life means the right to pursue happiness, the right to property, the right to liberty. All of the actions necessary to live an actual distinctive human life. It's not just the right not to be killed by thugs. It's the right to live a human life of rational production, free from interference by gangsters or by government, whoever it is that wants to try to undercut her pursuit of happiness. And of course, I think that also helps explain why it is that she is opposed to forms of collectivism like communism and socialism. If human beings were simply cells in a collective organism, they can be sacrificed to the greater good. If you're just a drone, what do you need protection space from others for? You don't have any separate purposes to pursue. You have only one purpose. That's the purpose of the greater good of the collective. And if you think your plans don't fit the 5-year plan, that's just an illusion, and in their view, you need to be exiled or executed. Now, let me make one more point to transition finally to the topic of abortion. Because everything I've just said applies in a certain context. It makes a big difference whether the business that we're talking about starting up is a business that's, let's say, manufacturing and distributing labor-saving devices like robots or iPhones or appliances. It makes a difference whether it's that or, let's say, selling and buying human slaves. If someone is buying and selling human slaves, that's a very different thing. And I think most people have the sense, at least these days, that you don't get to claim a right to run that kind of business. You don't get to claim a property right in the person of another. After all, rights are there to prevent conflict between the interests of people, and if one person owns another person's life, that's the biggest conflict that you could have. So the context for all of this, of course, is that the property that we're talking about is inanimate property that people actually create, not other people. Now, I say that, I give that example for a reason, because it's going to help us understand a little bit more about the nature of the abortion controversy. Because let's change the example now, and instead of talking about the woman starting up a business, let's say instead that she's gotten pregnant unintentionally and she wants to get an abortion. In fact, it could be the exact same woman who opened the business, and she thinks that having a child is going to interfere with her business plans. Suddenly, the same crowd of people who would have been very supportive of her pursuit of happiness in business suddenly has a new controversy to deal with when it comes to her choice to end the pregnancy. And of course, there's a reason for this. If that fetus, let's say, were simply, and it's not, but if it were simply a cancerous tumor, let's say, most people wouldn't object to the woman's removing it. They would see it within her right to life to do so. But of course, most people don't see the fetus as simply a tumor. They recognize rightly that it is a human fetus, that it has human DNA. Nobody can deny that fact. And so people see that and they think, well, the fetus is really more like the slavery case. You don't get the right to run your body any way you like to, if that means taking a slave with your body. You don't get to claim a property right to some entity if it's another human being, just like you can't claim property right to a slave. And so for the same reason, they'll say, well, the embryo or the fetus is a human being with rights of its own, so it can't come under the woman's rights. That's where the controversy is here. And that's where we have to ask, well, which interpretation is right? Is the embryo, is the fetus actually a human being, kind of like the slave is, as opposed to something more like a tumor, which nobody would have any dispute removing? Well, let's go ahead and think about those two examples, the slave and the fetus. Let's think back again to our example of why slavery was wrong. When you hold someone as a slave, you are interfering with the life of a human being in a non-human way. And the slave is obviously another human being. They have thoughts, they have feelings, they have plans for their lives. And so in taking a slave, you've transgressed from the sphere of your own life and trespassed onto another. You're treating another human being as though he were an animal or a tool, and you're acting in an animalistic way in your own. You're not actually engaging in rational production. You're manipulating the production of another being and acting like an animal. So that's what's true about the slave. Well, is anything like that true about the fetus or the embryo? And here's the point where you simply have to observe that there is no evidence that the fetus or the embryo has any thoughts or plans or ability to execute them on its own, doesn't have any ability to produce or trade or to negotiate contracts or boundaries or how to coexist with other beings. It has even a kind of sub-animal form of life. Animals have more autonomy than do the fetus, and do fetuses. Fetuses function instead by parasitizing the production and the work of the mother. Now, I think you will say, and many people watching this are likely going to say, but at the same time, yes, there are these differences between the slave and the fetus, and it's true that the fetus can't have any thoughts or plans or productive ability right now, but certainly it can have those things eventually, and it's that's of course true in many cases. Of course, not every fetus comes to term. But leave that aside for the time being. Take the best case. It's true that it's got human DNA, and in the best cases, being with human DNA will, if it's carried to term, turn into a fully formed human being. And if it grows up and if it's given a lot of help, it will. But look, as you can see from what I have on the screen here, there's still a big and important difference between the slave and the fetus. The slave is an actual human being. The fetus is only a potential one. And moral principles are for dealing with reality as it actually is. So think, for instance, of somebody who's completely brain dead. Like their brain has been removed, but they're on a heart-lung machine. They still have human DNA, but we don't treat them the way that we do actual human beings. Or how about corpses? Corpses have human DNA too. They all have human DNA, but different moral principles apply to them, and for good reason. So morally, it's okay to bury a corpse. Each of you is a potential corpse, and I guarantee you'll be one eventually someday. But that doesn't make it okay to bury you. That's because a potential is not an actual. And for all the same kinds of reasons, we need rights, we need individual rights to protect the lives of the actual individual human beings who are actually interacting with one another in an actual society. And so that's why, morally speaking, it's wrong to enslave or to kill an actual individual human being. But this doesn't give any grounds for for making it wrong to kill a merely potential human being, because a potential is not an actual. And if we only ever interacted with potential human beings, if we lived, let's say, on an island filled with nothing but fetuses, I don't think anybody would ever come up with the idea of individual rights, and we certainly wouldn't see why we needed it to give us any guidance in our thinking. Now, the one last point that I'm going to give to anticipate a potential criticism here is some of you will say, well, okay, fine, it's true that the fetus is only a potential and not an actual human being, but, well, what about young children? They aren't fully capable of thinking and producing on their own either. So is what I'm saying, does that mean that they don't have any rights either? I don't think that's the implication of what I'm saying, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, unlike the fetus, by a very young age, children do have thoughts and ability to solve problems and act and plan for their future, and their abilities are increasing continuously. And this is a big part of the reason why we do say that they have some rights. Now, they don't have all the rights of an adult. They can't go out and purchase property. They can't drive. They can't consume certain substances. What we do is we see their parents as their custodians of their rights, who are guardians of those rights until they mature into full adults. But what's clear in this case is that it's still the full adults that are the most obvious case, the paradigm case of the rights holder or the rights bearer. And other beings, like children, have rights only to the extent that they resemble fully formed human, mature, adult individuals. So what's then, I think, the main difference between children and embryos? Well, look, rights are for preventing conflicts between actual beings that can come into conflict with each other but need not. A fetus or an embryo that's physically attached to a woman is necessarily dependent on the mother. And for a woman who doesn't want a child, that means their lives are necessarily in conflict, and there's no possibility of avoiding it other than removing the fetus. And so what this means is that a necessary precondition for beings having rights is that it is an individual. Individual rights require individuation. And by that I mean both physical individuation and physiological individuation. It's a separate being, a separate place and space and time, and engaging in its own living activity. Even a child that needs to be fed by its mother is still autonomous in the most important way. And you can see that from the fact that once it's born, an unwanted child can be adopted. Anybody can take it away from the mother. Its existence is no longer any kind of threat or burden on the mother. But that's, of course, not the case with a fetus. So my view, and I think Ayn Rand's view, is that there's not a conflict between rights here. It's not that the woman has a right to choose and the fetus has a right to life. It's that the woman has the right to choose and the right to life, and the fetus doesn't have any. The only one with any rights here is the woman. Her rights are there to protect her from the interference of other people who are going to try to stop her from doing things like running her business as she sees fit and having abortions, among other things. So I'll just close with what I think is Ayn Rand's kind of summary statement of her view on abortion. And this is something she wrote many years after she wrote the earlier statement that I read you about individual rights. She formed her theory of individual rights, I think, well in advance of doing any thinking about any major thinking, systematic thinking about abortion. But when it came to abortion, her theory had immediate and obvious implications. She said, an embryo has no rights. Rights do not pertain to a potential, only to an actual being. A child cannot acquire any rights until it is born. The living take precedence over the not yet living or the unborn. Abortion is a moral right, which should be left to the sole discretion of the woman involved. Morally, nothing other than her wish in the matter is to be considered. Who can conceivably have the right to dictate to her what disposition she is to make of the functions of her own body? That's in her essay of Living Death. And I will to give you one more thing before we begin our conversation, which is just a list of takeaway points and a list of resources. So summing up what I've just argued for, in Ayn Rand's view at least, rights are there to protect the rational, productive actions of individuals in a social context. That's what they're primarily for. They have secondary applications, but that is the primary case. Embryos and fetuses are not even secondary applications. They are not individuals at all who are capable of the kind of rational, productive action that rights are for, and they're in conflict, necessarily in conflict with the kinds of beings who are, and those kinds of beings are, of course, women. And they are individuals. They are the ones who are capable of rational, productive action, and they are necessarily burdened by a being like a fetus in a way that they're not by a child once it's born. So that's the presentation, and I'll just mention, if you want to learn more about this, you can, first of all, I'd recommend, I'll put this in the chat. It looks like, there we go, yeah. Here's a link to the entry in the Ayn Rand lexicon, where you'll see a number of statements of Rand's on this, collected from different essays of hers. There's her essay, Man's Rights, which outlines her theory of rights as I described in the first half of my presentation. There's the essay I just quoted of Living Death, where she says the most that she says in print about about abortion. And then if you're interested in digging deeper into these issues to see what contemporary objectivists have said to apply Rand's philosophy, I would point you to the Ayn Rand Institute's publication, New Ideal. We have written a lot on contemporary debates about abortion. I've written 3 or 4 articles on it. So if you just go to that site, search for abortion, you'll get a whole bunch of articles. And I do encourage you to read those and to ask me questions about them. So I'm now ready to do that. And we can start with Gloria.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. It was an amazing presentation. Gloria, so it's your turn. You have like 25 minutes to talk about whatever questions you have. So
yes.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much, Ben, because the way that you organize thoughts and ideas, I think, is really important, especially in a continent where information about individual rights is rarely accessible in Spanish language, let alone the myths that are always spread about abortion. And I want to go through some of the questions and the myths that people have. The first off is this notion that people who are in favor of legalizing abortion, they all want to force the state to subsidize it. And I think that is untrue. You don't have to be in favor of legalizing abortion by forcing collectivism upon others, robbing them for part of their property rights. Could you talk a little bit about that?
A little bit, yeah. I completely agree with you that the one position does not entail the other. Ayn Rand certainly didn't think that abortion or any kind of medical care should be subsidized by tax dollars, and for all the reasons that I've mentioned, right? So the woman has the right to get an abortion if she can pay for it, but she also has the right to run her business as she sees fit, rather than having her business taxed to pay for other people's abortions. I think when people run these two issues together, they're ignoring the fact that the fundamental problem that even leads to this question in the first place is the current fact of socialized medicine in so many countries. So yeah, if the society believes that healthcare is a right, where what right means in that case is the right to have medical service provided for you for free at somebody else's expense, then that's going to lead to subsidized abortions, along with subsidized cancer treatment and subsidized coronavirus vaccination or whatever you want. And so the battle that needs to happen there is the battle against collectivism in medicine, which I think you can only do consistently if you adopt the same position on individual rights that supports abortion rights. And there's an interesting application of this, because currently in the United States, the major inroads that are being made against abortion rights are happening because defenders of abortion rights are typically people on the left who otherwise support the right to health care, who otherwise support regulating the healthcare industry. And so what the conservatives have typically done is they've tried to turn the tables and say, hey, you support regulating the healthcare industry, right? Well, then we better regulate these abortion clinics in a way that provides for all kinds of safety precautions. And this then has the effect of running many of these abortion clinics out of business. So this is part of the reason why the left is losing its case for abortion rights, because of its collectivistic views about healthcare.
Right.
And if the right, or if whoever it is that's opposed to collectivistic healthcare, really wants to oppose socialized medicine, they're going to have to accept as a price that this also entails the woman's individual rights to seek that same healthcare.
Thank you for clarifying that. Other of the myths is that the people who are in favor of legalizing abortion deny absolutely that life begins in the conception. And I have never searched for anybody who says that life doesn't begin at conception. That's not the issue. There are different forms of life. You have bacteria, you have viruses. I even read this very interesting book, Transcending the Levels of Consciousness, and it talks about the different scales of consciousness of different life forms. So it's not the same, the consciousness that you have in a human being, that the one that you will have in a mosquito or that you would have in a bacteria. But some of the myths come to the point of saying you deny that life starts at conception. Could you talk about that and the fact that no, there's no denial that life begins at conception, but that is not the issue of why the fetus or the embryo is not it's not a rights holder.
Right. Yeah. So way that I like to put this is the conception, the moment of conception, so far as you can identify such a moment, is the beginning of the human life cycle. That's absolutely true. And nobody denies that. Mm-hmm. It's not like advocates of abortion rights are completely ignorant of obvious findings in human genetics. No, the conceptus has a full set of human DNA, and if it's given a home for another 9 months to 18 years, it will develop into a fully formed human individual. There's no question about that. But this is why in my presentation I spent so much time trying to emphasize that if what you're talking about is the right to life, it's a very special kind of life that gets protected by a right to life. It's not just the existence of some DNA. It's not even a being with a heartbeat, which can maybe even feel some pain, or because there are lots of non-human animals that have heartbeats and can feel pain, but which we don't think have rights unless you're a very serious vegetarian or vegan, right? Mm. So it's the fact, what gives rise to the need for talking about rights is the facts that give rise to having to organize a society of individual beings who are all negotiating boundaries with each other as potential rational producers who want to live peacefully and coexist. That's where the notion of rights comes from. And that's the paradigm case of where it comes from. It then applies in secondary ways to other beings like children for the reasons that I mentioned. But when we're talking about a being that is not even physically distinct from its mother, it's literally feeding off its mother's body, this is not what the concept applies to. You mentioned also consciousness. Mm-hmm. I haven't read the book that you mentioned, but I don't even think that it's a point that the conceptus has a low amount of consciousness or a different kind of. I don't think it has any consciousness. I don't think there's any reason to think that it does. It doesn't have even the level of organic complexity that it would need to have. It doesn't have a brain center or sensory organs. Now, maybe there's a longer conversation to have about what consciousness is. But it's certainly a living creature. It's alive. It's not an independently living creature yet, but it's the beginning of a human life cycle. But simply beginning that cycle is not enough to give you rights. And if you really want to drive this point home, the way to think of it is, well, what about the unfertilized egg or the sperm? If you really want to be serious, that's where human life really begins.
Right.
And so, are we now going to say that sperm and eggs have rights as well? What's so special about having 46 chromosomes as opposed to 23? Why is 46 the magic number? Well, of course, the reason they'll give is you need to have that for it to actually develop fully. But of course, it's not guaranteed it's going to fully develop. And you need to have 23 for it to develop too. So it's a completely arbitrary line that they draw when they say that's the beginning of life. And they don't give a reason for why that would give it rights.
And I want to further on that point, because if we go on the scale of developed life, which you can have from bacteria to human beings, the different stages of development and processes of different life forms, then you're going to have a lot of life forms, a cow, a pig, a dog, a cat, already developed and formed and born, that will have higher levels of consciousness, higher levels of perceiving pain or joy or pleasure from a fetus. And the same people that defend that a fetus has rights do not defend that other more elevated life forms have rights. So how can that contradiction be manageable if it is not from this dogmatic view that only human life is sacred in any of its forms, from fetus to a corpse? But if you go through that, then it's not like a scientific explanation, because you can easily prove that there are other life forms in other animals that have higher levels of pain, of consciousness, of pleasure than a fetus. How can you explain that?
I think you're right that the people who defend the fetus on the grounds that it might have the ability to feel pain don't typically defend animal rights. Now, that might just be their inconsistency, and there probably are a few ones who are consistent about this out there. I suspect that there are some people who are anti-abortion and also pro-animal rights. But to get to the bigger question of substance, it's not that ability to feel pain is morally irrelevant. So, I don't think animals have rights, but I also think that it's wrong to torture them. I think it's wrong to inflict gratuitous pain on them. And so, if animals need to be killed for food, you should try to do it humanely, in a way that doesn't inflict pain. And I think that's the most that follows for the possibility later in the stages of pregnancy, where the fetus has maybe some capacity to feel pain. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't abort it. It means you should give it fetal analgesia, which exists. You can actually, and which is often used in later term abortions, just out of an abundance of caution.
Right.
Although I should also say I've looked pretty carefully at the evidence that's given for the possibility of fetal pain, and I've read the scientific papers by the most credible authors who argue for this, and I linked to some of these papers in one of my articles, which is in that with search results on New Ideal. It'll come up if you look it up. And what I see is the best evidence they give is that there are certain brain structures that are formed late in pregnancy, which brain structures are the same ones that are necessary for feeling pain once born. But it's not obvious that those brain structures are actually wired up in a way that would actually give them the anything to feel pain about. And more importantly, I don't think that pain, or pleasure for that matter, can actually matter to a being who has not yet developed any kind of self-consciousness.
Right.
I know people who've undergone certain kinds of surgery where they're given certain kinds of anesthetics or amnesiacs where they basically, it deadens their self-consciousness enough so they feel the pain but they don't care about it. And if you're a being who has not even been exposed to the world yet, doesn't know of its own existence, is at most aware of a fleeting moment of reality at any given time, it's not clear that pain would even matter to such a being, if it were even there to begin with in the first place. So we shouldn't cause beings pain. We should try to be humane with them. But that's not what rights are about. Rights don't concern prevention of pain.
Talking about preventing pain, if we go to the numbers, I asked this to the pro-life people, what is their plan? Because evidently, making abortion illegal or keeping it illegal is not banishing abortion from happening. Actually, from 42 million abortions that happen annually, the majority are illegal. And there is more pain in illegal abortions than in the legal ones. Why? Because they are done late. They are not done with hygienic or clinical conditions. So not only the fetus dies, more women die, and there are more dismemberments of fetus in the second and even the third trimester, because we're talking about illegal abortions. So when you present this data to pro-life people and you ask, what is your plan? Because keeping it illegal, like keeping drugs illegal, is not preventing it from happening. It's actually making it happen more. There is a strong case to make that if you legalize it, there is more information. With more information, there's less ignorance. And then, ironically, by legalizing abortion, you can prevent them from happening in a dangerous way. But these false premises, as Ayn Rand would say, apparently people can live with having them, and they have no conflict whatsoever. It doesn't matter if you show numbers, if you show data, people will sustain that it's better for abortion to be illegal. Isn't this hypocrisy? Because they should feel part of, contributing for it to keep on happening.
Well, I don't think it's exactly hypocrisy, but it does point to a real problem in their position. I think what they would say in response to this kind of argument is to say, well, look, we also have laws against murder of fully grown adults, but those laws don't prevent all murders, and they never probably will because people will be able to sneak around. So that's not a reason to repeal laws against murder.
Right.
So that's an important point. But at the same time, there's a big difference between laws against murder of adults and laws against killing fetuses and embryos. And it's something that's in common with laws prohibiting drug use as well, which is that if it's correct that the fetus is not an individual human being with rights, then abortion is a victimless crime. And just like with drug use, if there's no identifiable victim who people know, who people are missing, or who've been harmed and want to come forward to get restitution, then it makes the laws against this victimless crime incredibly difficult or impossible to enforce. Mm-hmm. And that means that it then amounts to a kind of discretion to enforce them. And so the women who are, let's say, wealthy and who can afford to bribe the right people, yep. They'll get abortions as much as they want. They'll never get put in jail for it. But the women who are less well off, less socially advantaged, they'll be the targets of the discretion of the police. And so this has the effect of eroding respect for the law, eroding respect for rule of law and objective law. And there's a lot of that. That's the same way that it works with the drug laws, and I think with the immigration laws as well. When you criminalize an activity that is something that the large portion of the population is likely to engage in, which cannot be enforced against, then it requires the police state in order to enforce against it. And that destroys the rule of law.
That is precisely one of the unsolvable issues, because if you have 42 million abortions a year and you think that is a crime that should be punished, who is going to pay for 42 million women going to jail worldwide, which will amount to 420 million women in jail in the first 10 years? So it seems to me that it's like, keep it illegal, but there's no solution. And I want you to please explain what is the real difference in between a crime and abortion or taking drugs. Because people often say, well, if you're going to legalize abortion, then let's legalize homicide and let's legalize robbery. Could you please give us the definition of what a crime is and is not?
Well, that's basically the issue of what I talked about in my talk. A crime is an intentional violation of the rights of an individual. And for the reasons I gave, I don't think a fetus or an embryo is an individual with rights. And so legalizing one does not give grounds to legalize murder. There's important differences between fetuses and ordinary, innocent individual human beings. Just like for the same reasons I discussed, there are differences between abortion and holding slaves. That you can't justify slavery because, again, slaves are individual human beings with rights. One other thing I would say is that I think to answer your argument about trying to lock up millions of women, most abortion opponents are going to say, well, we don't actually want to lock up the women, we'll just lock up the doctors. Right? But I think this is a disingenuous move on their part because in their view, the woman is actually the one who's aiding and abetting the crime. She may not be the one who, actually snips the forceps or whatever. But if you pay somebody to murder someone in like a mafia hit, then you're not only found culpable, but you're usually the one who's most culpable. The person who gets paid to do it is just the lackey. They're just the accessory. If you're the one who ordered and paid for the crime, you're the one who goes to jail. And so if they really think that abortion is murder, I don't see any logical grounds for saying that women shouldn't go to jail for it.
Right.
And then, of course, you're right that would be quite a lot to try to enforce against.
Okay, I have two last questions. We talked in the beginning on how it is important and crucial for people to understand that not because you want to legalize abortion or decriminalize it, it means that it should be paid with other people's taxes, that everybody is completely capable as they pay their own cell phone or their own electricity bills to get their own abortion. Could you also explain that this also means that there's no way that you can force a doctor to practice abortions if it's against his or her will?
Yeah, it's the same principle. So if you're in a system of individual freedom, if you're in a capitalist system, then for the same reason that you can't force a woman to undergo a procedure
Right.
that she doesn't want, by which I mean childbirth, for the same reason that you can't force her to have a child, you can't force a doctor to end the life of that child if they have whatever kind of objections to the procedure, or if it's just not their line of business, or what have you. Now, I do think that the existence of socialized medicine creates dilemmas
Right.
in this regard, because if you're working for a hospital that's funded by the government, and let's say there aren't any other hospitals you can go to work at, you might end up being required to do things that you are morally opposed to. But that's again a reason to oppose socialized medicine,
Right.
not a reason to oppose abortion.
Thank you, Ben. I have one last question, and then we can go to the public's question. What would you say to people that say, okay, abortion is justifiable in other centuries, but right now women have the contraceptive pill, the morning after pill, they can use condoms, they have all these things in order to avoid abortion. And if they are enforcing abortion, it's because they are irresponsible. And being free means being responsible. The ability to respond to whatever acts you willingly choose for your life. This, of course, takes away rape, right? And there are some people that are pro-life, but then they say, no, okay, but if it's rape and if the mother's health is in danger, then they put the woman first. But what would you say to this argument that it is absolutely irresponsible to talk about abortion in the 21st century, where women should be more responsible of their sexual activities?
Yeah, it's completely wrong. On lots of levels. I mean, so it's of course true that, yeah, if you don't want to have a child, you should use all kinds of contraception. And so that is part of being responsible. But it doesn't follow from that if you end up getting pregnant anyway, that what it means then to be responsible is to go ahead and have the child, for lots of reasons. For one thing, you might have taken the contraception and it might not have worked. It's never 100%. So you did the responsible thing, but you had an accident in effect, and now what do you do? Well, think about it this way. I like to give the following example as an analogy. Driving a car. Okay, so most of us think that driving a car is an important necessity in modern life, but driving a car comes with certain risks, and you can take all kinds of precautions against those risks. So you can wear your seatbelt, you can get car insurance, what have you. But even if you take those precautions all the time, people still end up getting into accidents. And so what would the abortion opponent say in this kind of case? Well, you took the precautions, but you still ended up having an accident. And let's say you were injured in the car crash, so you should be responsible and just live with the injury, right, and not get it fixed. No. The responsible thing to do is, having gotten into this accident, to fix the problem that you got into. I think that the reason that people don't see the parallel between those kinds of cases is because basically they regard sex as irresponsible in and of itself. They think that sex is dirty, they think that it's immoral, they think the responsible thing to do is basically just to not have it. And I think that's a profoundly evil idea. I think that if you believe in individual rights, one of the rights you believe in is the right to the pursuit of happiness. Happiness is not immoral. In fact, it's the most profoundly immoral thing. It's the most profoundly moral thing that you can pursue, and sex is a big part of that. So there's other things to say about that example, but I think that's the essential.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Thanks, Gloria. Great questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we have a lot of questions from here, from Zoom, and we also have a lot of questions from social media. So I will mix a little bit of them. The first one is from Fernando. He says, the ability to reason is what makes the great and fundamental difference between human and animal, not the exit of a uterus. This ability does not arise as if by magic at birth, and there are studies that reveal even its exercise as it develops at 6 months in the fetus brain, the cerebral cortex. What would be the difference to have individual rights a few moments before birth against a few moments after birth? Finally, the newborn also has a poor level of freedom. So can you comment on this comment or question?
Two important things to say in response to this. The first is, even if it were true, which it's not, that there was reasoning activity going on in the brain of the fetus before it was born, this would not mean anything, would not make any difference for the argument that I've been making. Because in the objectivist viewpoint, at least, it is not the mere possession of a rational faculty, or even the mere use of a rational faculty, that generates rights. That's one of the necessary conditions, but it is not the whole of it. It's the whole complex of things that I mentioned. It's the use of your reason in order to survive. You need rights to be free to use your mind in order to produce and live in a social context. And even if there's some magical thinking going on in the brain of a fetus it's unable to do anything with that thinking, and it doesn't need to be given freedom to live. It just needs a placenta, basically. I sometimes give the following example to illustrate this point. Suppose that we discovered a alien species from another planet which also had some kind of rational capacity, and so was able to form concepts and formulate scientific theories and things like this. Would that mean that the alien species has rights? No, not by itself. Even if the alien species used its mind to survive in some way, if the only thing that can keep the alien species alive is using its mind to drink the blood of human beings, then we are in a necessary conflict with each other, right? We are in a state of war. If we're the only way they can live, we can't think or hold that they have rights that we need to respect. So what gives a being rights is the possession of the whole enchilada, of the whole complex of traits that human beings have when they use their minds to survive in a social context in a way that allows for peaceful coexistence with other human beings. And that's not the case with the aliens, so it's especially not the case with the fetus. And then I'll say the second thing, which is that, yeah, it's true that when you're born, this does not magically give you a fully formed rational faculty.
Right.
And you don't magically get a whole set of rights because of that either. That's part of what I've been trying to stress. It's only when you're born that you can begin to acquire rights. That's the way that Ayn Rand puts it. It's very precise. And this is part of a broader issue in epistemology. There were some people on Twitter saying, you're not a biologist, you're just an epistemologist. Well, here's where epistemology is really important. There are no magic lines in nature anywhere on any topics. for any categories. There are only the lines that human beings draw. Now, that doesn't mean that they can draw them just any old way they like. This is Ayn Rand's broader perspective on the nature of concepts. And if you want to learn more about it, read her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Her view is that human beings have to draw lines where there are the most significant similarities and differences that they observe in ways that matter for their own ability to understand the universe. And one result of this is that sometimes, there are going to be what she calls borderline cases, where there's a certain range where you could draw the line here, you could draw the line here. You got to draw it in here somewhere, but there's nothing in nature that dictates where you're going to draw it. You have to draw it according to a certain choice that you make in relation to your own purposes. And I think that's true also when it comes to when does an individual human being first have rights. It's going to be somewhere around birth. You can have an interesting conversation about where exactly. Like, is it when you first cut the umbilical cord? Is it first when it first emerges from the womb? There's lots of questions here, and it's probably going to be, you're going to make different choices in different legal systems based on their history and their social context. But that doesn't make it subjective or relative. What it makes it is there's an option within a certain range, but outside of that range is there's a lot of facts that constrain that. So this is a much broader issue in not just moral theory, but in epistemology, and I encourage people to read Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology to learn more about that general issue.
Thank you, Ben. And there's a question related to that one from social media. They say, should abortion always be legal or first trimester or up to 8 months? And I will add to this question, can you make a difference between if it must be or if it should be legal and if it is moral to have an abortion at 8 months or 9 months just before giving birth?
Yeah, that's a good qualification. So there's some misinformation out there about what Ayn Rand's position was herself on this. There are things that she said that make some people think that maybe she thought it shouldn't be legal later in pregnancy. And I wrote an article explaining her views on this matter called Ayn Rand's Radical Case for Abortion Rights. In fact, she thought that abortion should be legal up until birth. Now, she thought that people could more understandably disagree with her when we're talking about later in pregnancy. But her own position still was it should be legal all the way through. And I agree with her position for all the reasons that I've tried to defend in my talk, which is that until a human being is an individual human being, they can't begin to acquire individual rights. It's only once they're a separate being in a social context where there's a need to apply that concept to them. Now, yeah, you're right. There are questions of morality that are independent of questions of legality. And so, for instance, this is part of the reason why I would say, even if it's a small chance that late-stage fetus can feel pain, and you're going to have an abortion, a moral person is going to use some kind of fetal analgesia to make sure they don't feel any pain. Now, what would an actual immoral late-term abortion look like? Maybe one where you don't care if it causes any pain. But apart from that, it's actually hard for me to think of examples. And that may sound shocking to some people because it's a myth that there are many, if any, women who wait until 8.5 months and only then, just as a matter of convenience, decide to have an abortion. Because, for one thing, that's not a very convenient operation to have. Nobody carries the fetus that long and then thinks on a lark, oh, maybe I won't have it. The overwhelming majority of abortions that happen that late in pregnancy happen because there are complications in pregnancy where the woman's life is sometimes at risk or where there's going to be severe fetal abnormality. And so these are often the cases where abortion is most important to protect a woman's life. And it's interesting to observe the kinds of double standards that there are about this, because you'll often, when you ask people who are opposed to abortion, they'll often say, well, I'm not going to go to extremes. I still think there should be exceptions in the case of the life of the mother. But those are the very cases where late-term abortion that they want to prohibit is most needed. And therefore, I think if you believe in the right to the pursuit of happiness, where abortion is the most moral.
Thank you, Ben. I have a lot of questions, so I will start to choose. I'm sorry for the audience that if we cannot get to all the questions. But Jose here is asking, how do you avoid abortion becoming an anti-conceptive method in developing countries like Argentina, where medicine is free?
I don't know all that much about the situation in Argentina regarding contraception. I agree that it's not something, abortion is not something you should use as contraception. It's for the reasons that I just discussed. It's much better to try to nip it in the bud, as it were, and prevent conception in the first place. What I know about this is that it's much more likely that abortion will be used as last-ditch contraception when women don't have the ability to get regular contraception. So when there are laws that are passed restricting access to ordinary contraceptive methods, that's where women start using abortion as a last ditch. But that's just a reason to not have laws restricting contraception. I mean, there's if you have a free market where there's no restrictions or regulations on the production of contraceptives, you have an abundant supply, and they become cheap, and anybody who can afford a little bit can get them, and get them for free from charities who are happy to give them out because they don't want women to be stuck with this terrible choice later on.
There's a question here for both of you, Ben and Gloria. This is Steven asking, as a libertarian, how do we deal, well, I know you're not a libertarian, you're an objectivist, but it's the same.
Yes.
How do we deal with conservatives who wants to use the state to perpetuate their ideas with a religious focus? Ben, you want to start?
Gloria, you wrote a whole book on this topic. Maybe you should mention the book and
Thank
start.
you. Well,
You're muted.
sorry.
Gloria, you're muted.
Yes, there. So I think there are a lot of people, especially in Latin America, who blame the left for using the state in order to annihilate your economic liberties. But at the same time, they don't realize that some of their dogmatic views are also using the state in order to annihilate other liberties in the individuals. When we really question why is it that prostitution, drugs, adoptions for gay couples, abortion is illegal in Latin America, we won't find data that tells us that there are less deaths, less violence, less trafficking, more peace, and more progress because of these things being illegal. There is not rational arguments when you look at the data that can serve as to explain why some liberties are illegal in Latin America. And when you don't have reasonable data as to sustain why something is illegal, then you don't have other choice but to understand that it has something to do with dogmatic views. Dogmatic views that manipulate the state in order to sometimes act in very unlawful ways. Let me put an example. There is a charity organization called the Abortion Ship. So this is a big boat that goes all over the world, and it stops in international waters in front of countries where abortion is still illegal. So they are not making any unlawful activity. They are in international waters, and people can come from the ports directly there. It's like the same that rich women do when in their countries abortion is illegal, and they take an airplane and they make an abortion somewhere else. Okay, so in Guatemala 4 years ago, this ship was there in international waters, and somehow the state, with the military, the Catholic Church, and the evangelical church, violated completely all international laws and the fact that we are supposed to be a non-religious state where religion is one thing and the state is another. And they kicked out the ship and it had to go. And there were lines of women waiting to get an abortion. So when you see those examples, it is impossible to think that there is some dogmatic explanation that has nothing to do with rationality, nothing to do with the separation of church and state, as to why we act the way we act. And when you show people data, they don't care. If you show to them that more people are dying because drugs are illegal, that more people are dying because prostitution is illegal, they don't care. It's more important to maintain the myth than the lives that this myth are putting in danger.
Yeah, so I think the question of how to deal with conservatives who want to use the state to perpetuate their ideas with a religious focus, it depends on which conservatives you're talking about. There's different kinds. If, let's say, they're a conservative who nominally wants the state to institute their religious ideas, but they don't think that at a very deep level, then I think what you have to do is you have to talk to that person and try to get a sense of what they really care about. Is it really this religious idea? Or is it that they see the religious faction as the only real opponent of left-wing collectivism? And if the reason they care about that is because they really do value individual freedom, then I think what you have to communicate is, well, yeah, but look, these religious conservative ideas are actually opposed to individual freedom. So it's not just in the case of abortion. It's in lots of other cases. The whole Judeo-Christian worldview and its demand for faith in a higher dimension is what gives credence to the idea that morality is about sacrificing oneself to others, whether the poor or to God. And that's the ultimate moral basis for collectivist and socialistic systems. It's not an accident that Europe went from Christian to Marxist, virtually within the course of 100 years. They had the same moral ideas. They cashed in on the inheritance of the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. Is what the Marxists did. So if they're the better type of conservative who really does value freedom, I think you need to communicate that those religious ideas are actually antithetical to the kinds of freedoms they really believe in. But now, if it's a different kind of conservative who's really very serious about their religion, and they don't care about the impact of their ideas on freedom in the way that Gloria was just illustrating by saying they don't care if however many people die because of these religious policies, well, then I don't think you can deal with them in the sense of have a rational argument with them. There's nothing that you can say to change the mind of somebody who is committed to a kind of irrationality. All you can do is let them deal with the consequences of that and hope that you can avoid them yourself. And part of what that will mean then is trying to find the better people who are in that political camp and to try to separate them from each other and try to get the more rational ones to see a better way and to leave the other ones to their own devices.
Okay.
And you're muted now, Maria.
Sorry, thank you, Ben. Do you have, both of you, 15 more minutes? We have a lot of questions. Yes? Okay. So let's go until 45.
Okay.
15 minutes for, yes. So Marcela is asking, I get confused by the use of potential. If potential individual is not an individual, but children who are potential adults are not adults with their full rights, Could you please clarify the use of the term?
Well, you're using it correctly, I think, and you're using it precisely. It's true that children are potential adults, and so the issue here is not that there's two classes of things. There's things that are only potential, and there's things that are only actual. Everything is an actual something and a potential something else. Things change, right? So the issue is that what it takes to be a being in possession of rights is you need to be an actual individual human being. Now, an actual individual human being might not yet be an actual adult. That's true. But it's passing the threshold of being an actual individual that gives you the chance to start acquiring rights. And the fact that you're not yet an actual adult is part of the reason why you don't yet have all the rights that you need. And you only will when you get to the age of maturity. But there's still a big and important difference between the merely potential individual, which is the embryo or the fetus, and the actual individual who's not yet an adult. And the difference makes a difference because it's a difference between being connected to another being's body or not. And it's that fact, when the fetus is connected to the mother's body, that's what makes its existence a burden for her, an unavoidable burden for her. There's no negotiation of boundaries that you can have between two beings in a case like that of the sort that would give rise to the need to talk about the rights of each. It's only when you talk about beings that are more or less co-equal beings in a society where you need to negotiate boundaries, and those boundaries are what we call rights.
Okay, here we have a question for both of you. Why have abortion if the mother can give the baby up for adoption? Is 9 months of pregnancy such a burden that's not worth saving a human life?
I'm going to defer this question to the women in the audience first.
Okay.
You're muted.
Where is? Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're muted.
Okay.
You want to repeat?
So, pregnancy in itself is a process of 9 months where a lot of things can happen, including the change in a woman's body that does not go back to the way it was if an abortion is it's the decision to make. Now, second of that, because it is a process, it is not guaranteed that if you keep the child, you are going to complete. There can be miscarriages. There are a lot of things that can happen in between right now and 9 months. Now, it is scientifically proven by the data that we have that it is much more of a trauma to have a kid and then give it away than to have an abortion. In the data that we have, and there are excellent talks and researches made in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, because also we don't have data in Latin America because everything that is illegal cannot be measured. But in the countries where we have data, the results are that 97% of women that go through an abortion do not change their minds, never in their lives. But it is also proven that once a kid is born, almost no woman, unless she is a psychopath, regrets having a kid. So once the baby is there and it is born, it is this natural mother instinct to take care of that baby. So you have these two outcomes. Women who have abortions, 97% of the time, do not regret their choice. And you also have the outcome that almost 100% of the women who give birth, they do not change their mind. So it is more traumatic to give a kid in adoption than to have an abortion early on, according to the data that we have. I wish we would have data in Latin America, but if we keep things illegal, we won't be able to measure. Also, a second thing, most of the slut shaming about abortion comes from men. So if we keep a line of saying that women who make abortions are irresponsible, are sluts, are killers, the vicious cycle that creates is that women remain silent. And the topic and the discussion about abortion is monopolized by men. I've been seeing this in my social media. Of 100,000 comments on the subject of abortion, 78% come from men, and 58% of those are insults. So if you have that as the norm in Latin America, what you have in the other side is silence. Silence brings ignorance. Ignorance, ironically, brings more abortions. So women remain silent of something that affects them. In the world where abortions are legal, it is calculated that 1 in every 4 women go through an abortion at least once in their life. Another interesting data is not necessarily a woman that goes through an abortion doesn't become a mother along the way. So you can have an abortion and then be a mother, or first be a mother and then decide to have an abortion for health reasons. The most shame and trauma comes from culture and society. So of course, if you live in a dogmatic atmosphere that tells you that if you have an abortion, you are a killer, you are a sinner, then the trauma can get higher. And I think those are psychological considerations that we need to discuss among women in Latin America.
You want to say anything else, Marie?
No, go ahead, please.
I basically agree with everything Gloria just said, and I'll just say a few things to amplify it. One is, I mean, you said, Gloria, that there's studies showing that childbirth is more traumatic than an abortion. I mean, it's more than that. It's that you're much more likely to die in childbirth than you are in having an abortion. Abortion is one of the safest medical procedures that exists. And childbirth is because it's much more traumatic, you're actually more likely to die. And there's a significantly greater proportion of women who die giving birth, even with our modern technology. So that's one reason. But even if you escape the possibility of death, Gloria, you mentioned, well, it's carrying a being in your body for 9 months in ways that have, irreversible effects on your body. But more than that, I mean, the process of childbirth itself is tortuous. It's if you have, natural childbirth, it is like physical torture. And you can get drugs that will, moderate that a bit, or you can even get a C-section. But then you're undergoing a risky surgery, which definitely has effects on one's body. So the idea that it's trivial to just carry the baby for 9 months and then give it up is crazy, to use the technical term, if I may. And yeah, one of the reasons that Ayn Rand was so supportive of abortion rights is because she thought, and I think rightly, that these laws have the effect of punishing responsible women more than irresponsible women. Because once a woman gives birth to a child, she'd have to be really irresponsible, or she'd have to be more irresponsible to think it was okay to give up the child to somebody she doesn't know. And yet that's not a choice she should have to make.
Gustavo is asking here, what if the procreator, the father, wants the fetus to be born? Why the right of the mother is superior than of the man? What would you say, both of you?
I don't think it makes a difference. It's her body. She's the one who has to carry that burden that we just talked about, and no desire on his part has any force, legally speaking, or even morally speaking, on her decision. Now, what I will add to that is that this cuts both ways, because so I think right now our current system is set up in a way that if let's say the mother wants the child, but the father doesn't, and she goes ahead and has it, as long as she can prove patrimony, then she has grounds for demanding money from him legally. And I don't think that's fair. I think that if he doesn't want to have the child, and if he expresses that legally and in a formal way before birth, then I think she gets to make her decision knowing she's not going to have his support, and then that's her decision and her responsibility. And I don't think that she should I don't think she should be able to demand money from him. Now that has to be, like I said, legally stipulated before birth. It can't be, well, he's supportive of the child and then she has it and then he changes his mind. No, then if she's decided to have the child with the expectation that he's going to help, then she should be able to sue for alimony, but only in that kind of case, I think.
I will only add,
Gloria, you're muted.
Yeah, I will only add that I dream of the day where science can go so far that you can take a fetus out or an embryo and either it can be developed in an artificial cradle or it can be implanted in all of the men that say that from the mouth out. I would love to see that. And also all the pro-life people willing to, get pregnant with someone else's fetus. Coincidentally, science can advance in those atmospheres where dogmatism and religion are separated from the market of ideas. So it's even in the best interest of dogmatic people, pro-life, who hate abortion, to step aside and let science do its work.
Thank you both. There's a question here from Katie. It's in Spanish, so I will try to translate it. What do you think of the post-abortion syndrome that affects millions of women? There's data that says that the abortion affects to the women's life for the rest of their life. So the question I think would be is should we protect women from abortion because of this post-abortion syndrome? What do you think about them?
Well, I think in part for the reason Gloria already mentioned, I don't really believe this is a real thing. I have myself seen significant statistical evidence that shows that like she said, a very high proportion of women who have abortions don't regret it. But let's just, for the sake of argument, suppose it was a much higher percentage who did regret it. That wouldn't change anything because people have the right to make the wrong decision. Like if it's just like with drug laws, I think there are people who use certain kinds of drugs that are destructive of their lives, but they're not violating anybody else's rights in using it. And if they ruin their life and they come to regret that, but they haven't harmed anybody else, that's their problem and not anyone else's. So but again, I challenge the premise of the question because I think it's a vanishingly small percentage of women who regret the procedure, and there are many stories in the other direction of how being able to have an abortion made the difference to their success in life. And if they hadn't been able to have it, they would have been tied down with something that they never would have been able to pursue their dreams.
Yes, I will only add that I think that as in any other decision, you need to be informed. And things that are illegal come with no information. If drugs are illegal, you don't know the substances. You don't know what poison you're getting in your body. If they are legal, you have information. The same with abortions. No woman, I don't think that abortion is in the bucket list of any woman. I don't think that any woman goes and says, oh my God, I'm going to have an abortion today. How fantastic. And precisely because it is a difficult choice that is about a life-changing matter, you should only do it if you want to do it, not because you're getting pressured, not by the state or the church or your family not to do it, or by a man that is forcing you to do it when you want to be a mother. So what I celebrate is women's opportunity to be informed, to make the decision that best fit their own interest. And the data shows that that is done when it is legal. And then, of course, there is all the liberty in the world for everybody to make a case on why it is better to be a mom or to give adoption or to have an abortion. Let the market of ideas compete. And if you genuinely want to help women, get information to them. But we're talking about a cycle that starts with, at least in Latin America, with women that are deprived of learning evolution, biology, menstruation. So if you're not even informed on how your body works, you cannot make accurate decisions.
Thank you, Gloria. I think we have time for one more. There's a question here. What is your moral evaluation of people who profit from abortion, like Planned Parenthood? I'm pro-choice, but have a hard time sanctioning that activity.
Well, there's only something wrong with profiting from an activity if the activity is wrong. And that's exactly what I've been trying to argue against here. So I've not simply been arguing that women should have the right to an abortion. I've been saying the reason that they need to have the right to choose an abortion is because abortion protects their pursuit of happiness, which I think is a moral thing. I think it's the most important and most moral thing. I wrote another article on this topic, which is called Abortion Protects What's Sacred About Life. Look that one up on New Ideal. And I'll leave it at that to let people think about it and explore further if they're interested.
And I will have one more last for both of you. I think with this we can finish. Ben and Gloria, what do you think is the best way to persuade someone of the morality of abortion as a closing argument for this webinar?
If you want, I start. I think that if you are truly moral, you look at the data, and by legalizing abortion, you are contributing to happier and more healthy lifestyles. And it is ethical to understand that your right to live is not only your right to exist, because for what good is existence in itself if you cannot choose the way you want to exist? I always remember an ethics professor, Armando de la Torre, in university, who told us, who would rather have liberty than life? And we were all like looking at each other like, I don't know. And then he asked, who prefers to be alive than being free? And then some people raised their hand, and he said, well, personally, I rather have liberty than life. Because if someone tells me that for the rest of my life I'm going to be enslaved in a concentration camp, I put my liberty first than my life in itself. But that's me. And everybody is entitled to its own decisions. So I think that the most moral attitude towards this is to understand that your right to life is your right to live the life that you want to be. And that includes being a mother when you want to be a mother. There is no question whatsoever that motherhood is a life-changing decision. And because it is so important, it should be taken by the person who is getting pregnant and not the rest of society.
I'd say two things. One thing I would say as a philosopher, and another I would say as a human being, to the extent that those are sometimes distinguished. Mm-hmm. The first is philosophical point, which is, so I get the sentiment that Gloria is trying to express with the choice between being free and being alive. But a big part of what I've been trying to argue is that, I agree with Ayn Rand's view that there really isn't a choice, that the life of somebody who isn't free isn't really a life. It is not a human life in the way that matters. And so if you can explain to people that this whole notion that abortion is anti-life and that anti-abortion people are pro-life is a complete travesty. It's not even close to true. What a person who's, and this is why Ayn Rand called her essay Of Living Death, the essay where she talks most about this, the kind of existence that the anti-abortionists want women to live is not a real human life. So that's the philosopher's point. But to make the more human point, if you want to put it that way, if you just want to, what's the one thing that is the most likely to actually psychologically, realistically change people's minds about this? It's talk with a woman who's had an abortion. Find out what difference it made in their life. And this has an implication, I think, also, because if women who've had abortions want to change people's minds about this, they should stand up and tell them these stories. This is, I think, the element of what's good about the what they call the Shout Your Abortion movement. There's things I don't like about that movement, but they're absolutely right that unless abortion opponents are able to put a human face on the individuals whose lives they want to shut down, they won't change their minds. But there's good evidence to think that when they see the real effects on the real people that these policies have, and when they see the real effects on the real people that the absence of these restrictions have, it can change their minds. This is the reason why the movement to legalize same-sex marriage, I think, has been so successful in the West and happened so quickly, is because after it got to a certain point, people started realizing, oh, wait, my brother's gay? I just didn't know that. And now he wants to get married. That seems weird to me, but how can I stop him? And I think it's the same way with abortion. And the more people know of how many women have improved and benefited their lives because of their abortion, the more it will be impossible, if you're a human being, to oppose that.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Gloria. We have still a lot of questions, but I promise to people, I choose the ones that are more focused on the topic, but I will try to send these questions to Gloria and Ben, and for sure we will have another opportunity to keep going with this difficult topic, so I will invite you, both of you, to continue. So thank you for the audience, to be here. Again, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Gloria, and hope to see you soon.
Maria, can I do one more thing before we go? Just to share one last piece of information with people about if they're interested in learning more about Ayn Rand and her ideas, please go to your Apple Store or your Google Play Store, download the Ayn Rand University app. This has hundreds of hours of free lectures by objectivist intellectuals and by Ayn Rand herself. And then this one's a little after the fact, but Maria, you're an alumnus of the Objectivist Academic Center. Gloria is currently a student. We're happy to have you both. We recently actually, the deadline for applications passed a couple of weeks ago, but when we have really good late applications, we will still sometimes consider them. So it's not too late if you're a good candidate and you want to engage in a 3-year program studying objectivism to apply. So just look up Objectivist Academic Center online.
Thank you.
I agree. It was a very inspiring and big difference before and after taking the program. So I would recommend it completely. And I want to thank to Nixon and Agustina too for helping me with this webinar and choosing the right questions. So again, thank you very much. See you soon. And okay, good premises.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Gloria.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Maria. Okay.